Sup, bitches?
You're watching Fugitive Red Eye, and welcome to another movie review. Today I'll be reviewing the two Terrifier movies. Now, Terrifier is a modern slasher franchise that there are currently two movies in. They're actually working on a third, which I'm actually excited for. Ideally, it'll stay good throughout, but we'll see. But these first two movies have been great. Spoiler, I liked these movies. There you go. Now, I've always been a fan of slashers, but I tend to gravitate towards 80s or sometimes 90s slashers. There's a few from like the 2000s and a few others that are still good. But for the most part, the slasher craze was the 80s, primarily, with a little bit of the 90s. A lot of modern slashers, though, I feel try to recapture that 80s aesthetic and stuff. And it's not just slashers, just kind of horror in general. Everything does it now. You had things like Stranger Things and It, which tried to recapture the 80s, sort of, and things like that. But I feel like a lot of the things that do that nowadays, that try to recapture the 80s, just throw in a bunch of 80s references and music and have it take place in the 80s, and they think that that's just good. We'll just nostalgia bait people. I think Terrifier is much more successful at capturing that 80s slasher vibe, and it doesn't have to fucking rely on that. It takes place in modern day. And it feels way more like an 80s slasher than anything else that just tries to recapture it by throwing in a bunch of 80s stuff. The intro to Terrifier 1 is very reminiscent of the intro to Nightmare on Elm Street 1, where Freddy's like building the glove and stuff. It gives very similar vibes. So Terrifier is about a clown called Art the Clown, who's really more of a mime, but I guess mime is kind of a subgroup of clown when you really think about it. He never says a word, but he's incredibly expressive and very good at getting across what the character is thinking. And I think that that's really good. It really works to the strong suit. Because you get sort of the goofiness of a Freddy Krueger, especially in the second movie, but also in the first movie, without having to have any of the lines, so he's still got the menacing silence. And he's very creepy because of that. Art the Clown is a very creepy slasher villain. But in these movies, he's not acting like a clown. Corbin actually did a very good video on this, although he does act a little bit more like a clown in the second movie, I would say. But Corbin brought up in his video, you know, the difference between Killer Clowns from Outer Space versus Terrifier, which, like I said, it's a pretty good video Corbin did. And we watched the Terrifier movies on Tubi, which, again, I always say, really good app. I like the selection they have, but that's beside the point. Terrifier 1, I think, does a really good job with the creepiness of it and how it all takes place in mostly one location. I really like that. But I like Terrifier 2 more, actually. But one thing that sets these apart from a lot of slashers is the Terrifier movies are really fucking gory. They are really over-the-top gory. Now, the first movie is fairly grounded in that there's not a whole lot of supernatural stuff. There kind of is at the end. But the second movie, Art's brought back to life. You know, it always happens in these slasher movies. The villains come back. And there are some shit where it's like people survived getting hit in ways that would kill normal people. But you know, it's a slasher movie, what do you expect? But these don't feel like modern movies, because of the sheer amount of gore, and there's nudity in the first one. There's a little bit of nudity in the second one, kind of, but not to the same degree. And there's no, like, full-on nudity, really. But Art the Clown has this sort of sadistic sense of humor about him, where he's, like, being a goofball while brutally fucking ripping these girls apart in these most graphic ways. And he seems to be very specifically invested in torturing the female victims way more than the male victims. Which, you know, that's par for the course in slashers, but you wouldn't expect it from a modern one, and I love that. The movies also have a really kick-ass soundtrack I really like. I like the Terrifier theme. I've listened to it quite a few times since watching these movies. And these movies have become some of my favorite slashers. Like I said, Art is definitely up there with, you know, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Chucky, you know, all the classics. He's up there with them for me now. So the fact that a modern movie franchise, a modern franchise could elicit this from me gives me some hope, at least for the independent scene. Now, the next one's going to be more big budget and get a more wide release. So that's one thing that I'm a little wary about, that is if it gets too big, if they change it. But ideally, since the same creative team's involved, it's just going to be the same thing, but with more ability to do crazy shit. Terrifier 1 didn't have as much of the weird character stuff in the second one, and what I mean by that is all the scenes with the family can be kind of annoying in the second movie. But I will say this, despite that, the characters are more memorable, even though, again, it's a slasher movie. You're not necessarily watching it for the characters, but the little kid in the second movie is my favorite character in the second movie. You know, besides Art. Obviously, Art is my favorite character in both movies. But when Art comes back to life in the second movie, with his facial expressions and stuff, it's kind of implied, I don't know if this is intentional or not, but it's kind of implied that he doesn't even know what's fucking going on. Like, he doesn't know that he's a supernatural entity, and he's just kind of fucking rolling with it. Like, there's this pale little girl that appears in front of him, and he's just kind of gives her this, the fuck is this? Okay, fuck it. I'm going with this now. And she's like his sidekick in the second movie. But like I said, these are much gorier than most slashers you would see, and I love that. They're so fucking gory, like very brutally so. And again, Art's just being a goofball while ripping people apart in the second movie, especially. In the first movie too, to a lesser extent, but very much so in the second movie. There's this one scene in a costume shop I really like where Art walks up and he's like honking this little bike horn. Or there's this part where he cuts off this chick's head and is like passing out candy from it as if it's this elaborate trick-or-treater bowl. I think that's really funny, and like one of the kids reaches for his second piece of candy and he slaps their hand away. There's also this weird scene in like this clown cafe thing that's supernatural, and like there's all these quote-unquote kids in there that are all played by adults that don't look anything like little kids. It's really funny. So if you like a good gory slasher with an interesting horror antagonist, I think this is a really good new slasher franchise that I'm actually very optimistic about. I quite enjoy it. The second movie came out last year. There's actually a couple movies I like from last year, being Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, Terrifier 2, obviously now, and The Banshees of Inisherin. All those movies have been really good. But I felt that these movies deserve their own video, and if you haven't seen the Terrifier movies and you like classic slashers, then you're missing out, because they're really good. They really capture that old-school slasher vibe without having to rely on nostalgia bait. So I quite enjoyed them. This review was a little disjointed and all over the place. I didn't talk a whole lot about plot, but it's a slasher movie. What the fuck do you want me to do about that? There's also this weird thing where this girl's dad, like, designed this, like, really skimpy outfit for her. Like, it was a character he based on her, but she has, like, the skimpiest outfit. Throughout the whole movie, me and Corbin kept making jokes about how her dad wanted to fuck her and how she wanted to fuck her dad. Obviously that wasn't the intent, but it's just kind of weird. But it was funny, and it was entertaining. The whole movie was entertaining. I loved these movies. I would highly recommend them if you like slashers. But I think that's all I really have to say. Like I said, hopefully this wasn't too just disjointed for you guys to get something from it. I hope you enjoyed this review. I'm not going to do a whole lot of editing. This is one of those mid-tier editing ones, so hope you enjoyed. I'm going to try to do a movie review every night for the rest of the week, so stay tuned. Have a good one. Toodles!
Subscribe to Fugitive Red Eye.